In the name of God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, earlier this week, Victorian police arrested a pregnant 28-year-old woman in front of her partner and her other two children for planning an anti-lockdown protest in regional Victoria. Further arrests, of course, have also happened yesterday at a number of protests in Melbourne and in Sydney. In the statement regarding this arrest, Victoria Police said, "Any gathering of this nature is a blatant breach of the Chief Health Officer's directions and puts Victorians at risk." Well, how do we get ourselves into such a mess, such a pickle? Was the woman wrong for encouraging people to meet and to protest during a pandemic? Well, yes, of course she was. I think that's actually putting people at risk. Are we a society that is so messed up that a significant minority can actually buy into all kinds of conspiracy theories and even go as far as electing members of parliament who share in those kind of warped conspiracy views? Well, apparently, yes, we are that messed up. Were the police just doing their jobs enforcing the law during a state of emergency? Well, yes. Of course, they were just doing their jobs, the jobs that they are commissioned to do. But was it wise to enforce the law in the way that they did, arresting a pregnant woman in front of her children? Well, I don't think it was very wise to do it in that way. The arrest of an individual in such circumstances is actually supposed to act as a deterrent. It's supposed to send a message. Don't post those things on Facebook, don't cause people to gather, or you will get arrested. But unfortunately, the use of law simply as a deterrent not only necessitates the suspension of justice, it rarely, if ever, produces the desired effect of deterrence. It's said in medieval times that pickpockets loved public hangings for people who were pickpockets, because while everyone was watching the pickpocket getting hung, the other pickpockets would be picking pockets. It's not a deterrent. It never has been a deterrent. Besides that, of course, as a veteran protester myself, I know that arrest is no deterrent. In fact, it is considered as a badge of honour against many protesters. A little competition went around during a lot of the refugee protests to see who could get arrested the most. It's a badge of honour. And not only is it a badge of honour, it is a tool. Getting arrested is actually a tool for promoting your cause. But ultimately, there has to be a better way of organising ourselves beyond protesting as often as I've done that kind of thing. Now, this isn't a new argument. It's not a new dynamic that we're exploring. It's as old as civilization itself. St. Paul writes in his letter to the church in Rome, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. The one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment," says Paul, "are summed up in this one word: love your neighbour as yourself." Love does no wrong to a neighbour. Therefore, love is the fulfilment of the law. Now, when Paul writes these words to the early Christians in the city of Rome, he is entering into the same difficult dynamic as we're talking about in Sydney and in Melbourne this weekend. How do we obey the law? How do we love our neighbours? How do those two things dance with one another. Now, when Paul wrote to the church in Rome about the balance between obeying the law and loving your neighbour, he was entering into an argument that had been actually raging. It was the big argument of the day, really, in many ways. It had been raging for over 100 years. Now, you've often heard me talk about the debate between the two rabbinic schools, the school of the two sages, Hillel and Shammai. Now, for Paul, this debate between those two schools of thought, and they both agreed on what the greatest commandment was. It was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and with all your strength. A total agreement about that. The debate was about what was the second greatest commandment. And Shammai said the second greatest commandment is to be holy. In other words, to obey the Lord, to keep all the commandments. And Hillel said the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbour as yourself. And this debate produces a number of parables and stories, not least of all the story of the Good Samaritan, of course. But here's Paul writing to Rome, engaging in this very same debate. You've got the law, you've got the commandments, but the greatest of these commandments after loving God is to love your neighbour as yourself. Now, for Paul, there was an intensely personal connection to this debate, and an intensely personal connection to which side of the debate he comes down on. Now, often when we read Paul and we talk about Paul, we assume in many ways that he would come down on the side of the debate that is about the law, because he's very keen on keeping the commandments, and he says, I'm a great Jew, I keep all the commandments. But I believe we have to read Paul through a very personal lens. Paul was the student, or a student, of the great Jewish teacher Gamaliel. We see Gamaliel mentioned a few times in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles. That was Paul's teacher, Gamaliel, the person who formed him so deeply in all sorts of ways. I mean, do you have someone in your life that's really affected the way you think, the framework through which you think? Father's Day today, maybe not. That's someone in your life that's really affected, either for good or for ill, the framework that you have in your life. Or for Paul, this is Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was the grandson of Hillel. Hillel taught Gamaliel's father that the second great commandment was to love your neighbour as yourself. And Gamaliel's father taught Gamaliel that the second great commandment is to love your neighbour as yourself. And Gamaliel taught Paul that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbour as yourself. That's the lens through which we should always read St. Paul's writings. Hillel taught that after loving God, loving your neighbour was the greatest commandment, the fulfilment of the law. Legend has it that Shammai and Hillel were both asked a question, and that is to recite the whole Torah, all the laws, standing on one leg. Shammai just dismissed the questioner, but Hillel said, love your neighbour as yourself. That is the entire Torah. And all of the rest is just commentary. So clearly was he focused in that area. And this comes out in Paul's letter to the Romans. In one of the many news reports that we have seen on our televisions this week regarding the breakdown of civil society and the rule of law in the United States of America, I caught a glimpse of a building's facade as it panned across a protest. This is in Iowa. And carved into the facade of this building are the words, "Where law ends, tyranny begins." Now, these words belong to a British philosopher by the name of John Locke, but they were made most famous by the British statesman William Pitt. Pitt used the quote from Locke in the context of the law limiting a leader's powers, thereby preventing them from becoming tyrants. Now, while that is an entirely reasonable thing, it is not the whole story. For without justice, the law itself can become tyrannical. And that's the debate, although so misinformed and so out of context and so driven by conspiracy theorists and not helped by some of the aspects of media. That's the debate that's going on at the moment, especially in Victoria. How do we limit the power of leaders? In Australia we call them elections every 4 years in the States. That's how we limit the power of. And you know, honestly, if I was Daniel Andrews, I'd be saying, you know, if you're alive at the end of my term to vote me out of power, then I've done my job. That's what I'd be saying, because I think this is an entirely spurious argument. However, it does raise the issue of how law limits power. Our law dances with justice. Now, the law is most often about order. It's how we order our society. But order without justice always turns to tyranny. For Paul of Tarsus, for William Pitt, and for us, there is always the tension between order and justice, between law and love. The tension is a healthy tension, because when there are no tensions between law and justice, when there is no tensions between law and love, no balance, then order gives way to chaos, and justice gives way to tyranny. In today's Gospel, we hear Matthew suggest that when there is disorder, in other words, when there is breakdown in relationship, our first response should always be our first response should not be to simply try and impose order. Now, that's what happened in Victoria, in that young woman being arrested. She was promoting disorder, if you like. She was promoting to break the law, to gather people in disorder. And the state's response to that is to impose order as quickly as you possibly can. Now, I get why that happened, but Matthew offers an entirely different way. The Gospel offers an entirely different way of engaging in this dynamic. Not to impose order, but to enter into a contained conversation, reconciliation, to enter into a process. Order, at its most sustainable, is a delicate balance of law and of justice and of love of neighbour. Order should only ever be imposed as a very last resort, as perhaps in a state of emergency, and then only until balance of law and justice and of love of neighbour can be restored once again. Matthew suggests if there is disorder, that there's been a breakdown in relationship, that we should go to that person and sit down and seek to find out the cause of the disorder. Where has this come from? Not to sort of slap order on that person straight away, but to ask the question, what's happening in your life that has caused you to behave this way towards me? What's going on? How can we have a conversation that might restore order and balance again in the most constructive way? Then Matthew goes on to say, well, if that doesn't work, then take a couple of trusted friends with you, people who will keep confidences and people who will who you trust to help. Maybe the two people's perspective isn't quite as it should be, and maybe there are a couple of other wise people that can shine a light into this space and give it all a bit of perspective. And then if that doesn't work, then bring in a wider group, bring in the community, because this is essentially a community issue. And if that doesn't work, then and only then do you impose some kind of order. That person is to be expelled from the community. But what we need to know that in the early church, when people were what we call excommunicated, put out of the church, because they were being so destructive to the whole community, they were never sent out alone. It wasn't like, you get out and we don't want anything to do with you. Someone was always sent with them to continue to nurture them, to help them, to amend their lives. And the purpose of excommunication was always only for the amending of the person's life. And the expectation was that they would be welcomed back into the community once again. In the early church, this was done on Easter Eve. There was a great service of reconciliation on Easter Eve, because the church felt that it couldn't really celebrate resurrection if the body of Christ was divided, was shattered. And so their hope and their dream was always to reconcile that person once again to the community, where balance between law and justice and love of neighbour could be restored. Now, we are living in a state of emergency, not officially in New South Wales, but we are living in a state of emergency. And it's not because of the virus, it's because the world is out of balance. The virus is simply a symptom of a world out of balance. How do we restore that balance? Now, we can waste our time arguing about the rightness and wrongness of lockdowns. We can waste our time and energy seeking to balance economic numbers against the numbers of possible deaths if we reopen our economy again. But we will be trying to reconcile the wrong things. Balance can only ever be restored when we reconcile with one another. And the journey back into that state of divine and blissful equilibrium begins with one very simple choice: to love your neighbour as yourself. The Lord be with you.